Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. I recently got the opportunity to sit down and talk to Trip Miller, a knife collector and investor in a bunch of fine blades. And this is the conversation that we had. This is part one of two-part series, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and I am joined by knife collector and knife enthusiast extraordinaire, Trip Miller. How you doing, Trip?
I'm good, Aaron. How are you?
Doing great. I wanted to have you on because probably for the time that I've been in pocket knives, I've been on some of these Facebook groups especially, and I've noticed that you have a penchant for sharing some of your wonderful collection with people and talking through things and whatnot, and also probably dictating some of the price of the market in the way that you sell your knives and collections here and there. And I wanted to get you on and just like pick your brain and talk to you about like this, like your aesthetic and how you collect knives and whatnot, and just hope that that's useful for some of our maker listeners that could use that information as well.
Yeah, great, excellent. I wanted to just say thank you very much for thinking of me and asking me to be on your podcast. So I'm very humbled and grateful that you would do that. So thank you very much for that. Number one. Yeah, so, Facebook groups, Blade forums comes to mind, older USN platform, I was on there too. But as far as where I spend, I guess, most of my time these days is probably multiple Facebook groups, various knife makers, various knife groups, slip joints, not slip joints. I kind of go into both sides. I do some tactical modern stuff, but I think near and dear to my heart are the slip joints. So, I spend a lot of time there as well, but I appreciate what you have to say. I do spend a lot of time there, probably too much, one could argue, but I do enjoy it, and I do appreciate, the opportunity to share what I have. I think that a part of my collection journey has been sometimes wishing that there was more being shared out there. So when I got into a position to share what I collect and what I find, which is a big part of my story, which we can talk about. But as I find things and discover new makers, and as I find knives I've been looking for 2 years, 5 years, you name it. It's whenever that happens, I enjoy the exercise of sharing those things with people. And I think a lot of it is because it's not always out there. You don't always get to see it, and so I felt like I sort of have an obligation a little bit to do that. That's just me. So.
Yeah, and I think that that resounds with me because we're kind of birds of a feather. Because in knife making, there was like a few people that would do knife making videos and talk about things on forums like blade forums and stuff. And as more makers popped on Instagram and Facebook and everything, I felt like the number of makers that really got to the heart of like the technique on how to do certain operations, I didn't really see that as much. And I also felt that there was a little bit of a veil with knife making. Like you don't really see the politics behind it. You don't see like the business side of it as much. And so I really have tried hard to document as much as I can about things as I learn them or have them conveyed to me. So that way everybody has the ability at least to look at that and add that to their own work. So, I mean, I very much agree that if we have the internet and the ability for everything to be accessible, it seems almost like a fiduciary duty that we would share that rather than keep it secretive and to ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're in tech. You had said earlier before the call here. I don't consider myself too tech savvy, so to speak, and I certainly don't spend a lot of time doing videos or doing things of that nature, although I could, I suppose. But at the end of the day, I found once I learned how to post things, and once I learned how to kind of taught myself how to take some photos, and still working on that. I don't consider myself a very good photographer, but I've learned a little bit, and so I've taken some time to learn some of these things and learn how to make some posts, learn how to, I hope, try to put up informative posts and sale posts and collection posts, and I try to do on occasion, I'll try to do a sort of a state of the collection thing, or used to at Christmas time, I would do a video of like my Pena collection and stuff like that. So I think what you said is true, which is that, we have this medium of internet and social media and so forth. And quite frankly, our community is a very small community on the big scale of things. And so I think just there's also that aspect of reaching out and touching people, and it's another, for me, it's another version of relationship building, basically. I mean, for lack of a better way to put it. But to your point, it's nice to be able to see some of these things, and I think I can appreciate what you said about like being a maker, and these things just appear, but then no one really told you how they got there, or how they did this nuance, or why this is this way, and that kind of information. I mean, I've always been sort of a people person, people pleaser, and I do feel kind of that it's a little bit of my obligation, or I feel something of an obligation to share some of these things, and I enjoy it. I mean, I think that it goes without saying, but I enjoy it, and I really enjoy I enjoy the camaraderie, and I enjoy the relationship side of it, and that's a big piece of it. And I think, not to jump ahead on your questions, but just to put it out there, I'll say up front that I know you had Dave Nemerson on the call on a podcast a few weeks back, and I'll say right now that he did a fantastic job. So, and Dave I've known for quite a few years, and we've met collecting, and so goes the story. We met online, I guess, and he happens to live up in New Hampshire, and he lives pretty close to my house, and he's been down to my house before, and I try to have a get together every year and do a barbecue here, and I invite people to come, and I call it Boston Blade. It's the Boston Blade Show. I live on the South Shore of Boston, and so that's or it's Blade and Barbecue, one of the two. Boston Blade and Barbecue and Blades. I haven't figured it out yet, but Dave does come down on occasion, and so I've met Dave, and he comes down, and we're friends. And I've driven up to buy knives from Dave, and so on and so forth. He's a great guy, and so I just wanted to say that out loud, that I thought that the podcast you did with him was excellent, and I would be thrilled if this particular one with me could even come close to his, because I thought he had some great things to say. But that camaraderie, the relationship part, the chasing, the chase part is, for me, is certainly, I don't know, 50-50. The ownership part's great and so forth, but I think for me, a lot of times it's the art of the deal, being patient and having things come, and finding and making the connections, and it's really a relationship thing for me, and I think some of the things you and I have talked about previous to this call, a little bit about, maybe what motivates you, or how do you, if you're a new maker, how do you get your knife sold to people like myself, or so on and so forth. And a big piece of that, I think, not always, but a big piece of that starts with the relationship part, and so many people in this, in our world that I've looked up to, or really respect their opinions and so forth, have said to me through the years, it's a lot about the maker and that relationship and who they are. And I've found that to be very true, which is that, the makers that I have connections with, the ones that I respect, the ones that, are in it for the long haul, and that I end up having a connection with, something of that nature, that I'll stay along many a times, I'll stay collecting or interested and so forth. And then the reverse being that if you don't have that connection, or someone's really not in it, or unfortunately on occasion you might run into somebody you just, you don't feel you have a synergy with, let's say, a lot of times it's easier to let that go. It's not so, not as interested in the knife, it's more of a relationship thing. So.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think that it's difficult with knife makers because artists in general are prima donnas in some way, shape, or form, and it's like sometimes very abrasive personalities. It's like you make a really great work, but I don't know if I could stand being in a tent with you camping for 3 or 4 days. And that's not to disparage any knife makers, but sometimes I guess the outpouring of artistry is not necessarily analogous to how personable that person is. Sometimes they can be
Sure.
real great artists and real big jerks too.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure there's ego out there, and I think probably I kind of naturally stay away from it a little bit. Or if I see that, I can, maybe I'm not as into it. It's not to say that there's not a place for that, but I'm definitely the people that I tend to gravitate towards, at least from having met them or corresponded with them and so forth, have typically been very humble and very gracious and very pleased that they have the opportunity to do what something they love, and that resonates with me. I mean, for me personally, and I think that I respect that, and that's something that for me is important. And so I just think that a lot of times when it comes to my collecting, in certain cases with certain makers that I've had opportunity to meet or have a relationship with and so forth, I mean, I will pursue or try to pursue or at least consider pursuing, their work and investing some of my time and money and energy and so forth into them because of who they are. And I just think it makes a big difference. And so, you know, I think earlier on when you're kind of getting into collecting and so forth, maybe you're not seeing it that way right initially because you haven't had the exposure, haven't had the experience, haven't had the opportunity. But I think long haul, when you start to be sort of talking about being in it for a while, that stuff starts to be true to me. Maybe it's not true for everybody. I can only speak for myself, but for me, that's a big piece of the collecting part, and certainly the relationship part. I really enjoy the relationship part of the buying and the selling and getting to know the fellas and the gals. There's a couple gals out there, but definitely the fellas and getting to know them and having those relationships. And I mean, that's a big piece of it for me too. So yeah, I like knives and I like owning them and I like collecting them and so forth. But at the end of the day, they are just knives, and I consider myself a caretaker. That's pretty much how I think of it. I'm a caretaker, and eventually these things pass on, and I try to pass those things on too. I sell some stuff, expensive stuff high, and I sell some stuff for deals and so forth. It depends. But I do try to share the wealth. And there's many a times I've taken stuff that I've thought, well, I really don't want to sell it, but you know what? Aaron would love this, so I'm going to just sell it to him so he can enjoy it too. And I do that too. I try to share that wealth part too. So it's an
Yeah.
evolving thing.
Yeah, I wish I would have been your friend a few years ago when you were selling that Don Hansen fixed blade for super cheap. I would have had the money then
The
too.
hunter, yeah.
I love Don, and his work is amazing too. And so I actually don't have anything in my personal collection of his. So
Don's a great guy. I think I told you earlier, I'm originally from Little Rock. I'm from Arkansas. So even though I'm up here in the Boston, in the bad old Northeast, I'm originally I'm a Southerner, and I spent about a third of my life down south. Grew up in Little Rock and so forth, and then I spent about a third of my life out in Colorado. I went to University of Colorado, and I lived out in Colorado for about 14 years. And then my wife and so forth is from up here in the Northeast, and so we've been up in this area. I've lived in various places up here, but mainly Massachusetts for about 16, 17 years. So, but it's funny how many makers and that I tend to buy and gravitate towards and talk to are from Texas or Missouri, like Don, or down in the South, back down south. Like you talking to yourself, I thought it resonates with me very much. That just it's funny how that is, how roads lead back down there. But Don's a great guy. I've known Don for a while. I don't actively actually try to collect a lot of Don's knives. His knives are hard to get, number one. I've owned several of them. And I've passed on several of them to friends and people that really wanted them, that kind of thing. But he's a legend. He's a living legend kind of knife guy for sure. It's amazing. I was the other day talking to somebody about. I was putting together a fixed blade order, if you will, and I was talking to somebody else about their opinion on some things, as you do, and we were talking about W2 steel, and I was getting into this conversation about what's up with Don, and then I got educated on that he, I guess, bought up like all the W2 known to man basically at some point, and so he is sitting on a very large cache of W2 steel, and so therein, I didn't know that tidbit of history. I just knew that he always had it, and so all these guys, I guess, source it from Don, I suppose. So I don't think that's a secret, but I think that's a known quantity maybe out there for the maker crowd. But I didn't actually make that connection until just the other day. But he makes great knife, slip joints or otherwise, fixed blades as well. The one that you were talking about was a Steam Mill Hunter, actually, which was the collaboration knife he makes with his, I guess, his son and his brother, maybe? I don't know. It's three of them.
Yeah, at least his son. I can't remember exactly.
I think so. But those, I've had a few of them. They're really, really nice, and they are sharp. I mean, they're sharp. They're like, look at them wrong and they cut you, type of sharp. He's great.
Yeah. There's something that you were saying that I resonated with, and I totally forgot it because you're enigmatic. I just could listen to you talk about things. But one thing that interests me about the W2 conversation is that if Don or anybody didn't want to get it out into the world, that he bought up a bunch. Laren Thomas actually published it in his book. That was one of the ways that Don had gotten used to making W2 blades and everything. So it's in published work now with Laren Thomas's recent book. So
Got it.
No real secret, I guess.
No, I figured it wasn't. The way the conversation went, I took from the conversation that it was a known thing, but I was just like, oh, aha! I had this aha moment because I've been buying like David Bernier, some of his knives, and he's a big Don Hansen fan, and he'll have some, W2. He'll have some knives with Hamones and W2 as well as his own Ford, his own Damascus and so forth. But then I was also talking to somebody about a Michael Birch knife and that I had, and it had a Hamon also W2, all Don Hansen, far as I know. So he he's pretty prolific, but he's a great, he's a wonderful maker. I mean, he builds a hell of a slip joint. He builds a hell of a fixed blade knife. He's got his scary tack, his tactical, that's really great too. And then, he's got some art knife stuff out there too. If you look around, there's some pretty fancy art stuff that's out there that's not quite my cup of tea, but I appreciate it for what it is, and I really enjoy it. So he's just he's a good old boy kind of guy. I chat with Don quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, and I kind of want to backtrack just a little bit and talk a little bit about you and your, maybe like your career and everything, because I know you mentioned that you live in Boston area, but do you want to talk a little bit about like what you do for a living, primarily kind of like hobbies and things that maybe outside of knives, and then what got you into knives and knife collecting?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I was born and raised in Arkansas. So I grew up, part of this I'll preface with I grew up hunting and fishing and a lot of outdoors in the South. As many of, I'll throw out there that I'm 50. I'll be 54 this summer. So I'm grew up in the 70s pretty much, back when we were footloose, fancy free, and out, able to take our guns and walk the railroad tracks just outside of town and stuff like that. It wasn't a big deal, and no one ever thought anything about it, right? And so we always had knives and so forth. So I'll come back to that, but that's kind of where my real knife collecting began, was when I was a kid, and I don't even remember how old, to be honest with you. But I grew up down south. I went all the way through high school in Little Rock, and then I went out to Colorado, as I mentioned. Then I came out. I was back and forth. I've lived around, actually. I finished college in England, to be honest with you, and then I came back, went back to Colorado. I've lived up in New Hampshire. I've lived in Connecticut. I've lived in Massachusetts, so forth. Between kind of college and and a small stint of living up in Vail and being a ski bum for a while. I was actually in the motorcycle business, as I mentioned to you, for many years. I was a major motorcycle rider and racer, and I used to instruct road racing and was fast and furious, lived a high speed and fast lifestyle. And then my daughter came along. We were out in Colorado. My wife is from here. She got to be about 3, and we didn't have any family out in Colorado. And it kind of was one of those conversations about, do we want the kids to grow up around family like we had when we grew up, or do we want to be out here where nobody, we don't have any family? So we made the decision to move back up here to the Northeast, and that was in 2006. My wife's family's from up here, and fast forward, and I got into the mortgage business in 2006. The mortgage crisis happened, and 2 years later, and everything imploded. But it is what it is, and I stuck to my guns, and I stayed with it, and I put my head down, and I went out, and I just sold and originated loans, and fast forward, and I've been managing a team now up here in the Boston area for about 5 years. I always had management in my background at some level, but I went and sold loans for years. So I've always been in sales. So I guess, to kind of connect that, your question, and kind of to segue a little bit, what I would say is I was at JCPenney's, I was at Steinmart stores, I was selling motorcycles, I was selling mortgages. I've always been customer facing, and I've always been at the forefront of, ringing the register or opening the store or closing the store or taking care of the customer, that kind of thing. So I have a big customer service background. That's really my background. Sales, customer service, that kind of thing. So I'm a seller, really. I'm a sales guy, if for lack of a better way to put it. So I still do mortgages. That's what I do. I started with knives, when I was a kid. Like I said, I started out in the woods in Arkansas and stuff. We always were, always needed a pocket knife of some sort. We always had knives. We had deer, fixed blades, deer hoof fixed blades, and sacks, Swiss Army knives, the little saw blade on the Swiss Army knife. We used to cut down trees with the saw blade on the Swiss Army knife, that kind of thing. I'd get Swiss Army knives for Christmas. Graduated to like a buck knife and a 110 and the fixed blade bucks, with a sheath and all this stuff. So we would go mow lawns, and I'd go to Kmart and buy a knife. That was my summer sort of my gift to myself, was to go purchase a knife. So I started doing that when I was young, and I still have some of those knives. Some have been lost and some have been sold and so forth, but I still have this small set of knives that I've had in a little lock box that I've had since I was a kid, and I have had those all throughout my life. And I didn't get really back interested in going down this collection road, let's call it. I didn't get back interested really in doing that until about 12 years ago, somewhere in there. And maybe 10 to 10, 11, 12, something like that. I started having some actually, I started out doing some custom flashlight stuff, actually, and was sort of that's what kind of got me into this, discovering this whole EDC world, which I go ahead. It was a gateway drug, ironically. I don't know how that exactly happened. I became intrigued that they existed, like the titanium flash, this expensive flashlights. But seems like I was always searching for some sort of flashlight that was better than just the average, off the shelf type of thing. And so that was kind of a gateway drug, yeah. And then it transitioned over, and I'd always had this underlying current of wanting to collect knives and so forth, but I didn't really know how to start. I didn't really have anyone immediately around me that actually was heavily into collecting knives or anything of that nature. And just to put it out there, I actually I got sober about 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years ago this fall. And when that happened, that was really a turning point for me, for having more time, having more money, um, having more energy. I was up later at night. I was surfing the internet, whatever. But
Yeah.
I was just I had to refocus and go through the things that one might do when you try to get sober and so forth. And that was just obviously a major event for me personally. And so that really kind of kick-started things for me when that happened. I spent a lot of time just diving into sort of the knife collection and trying to expand that and so forth. And I don't even think, Aaron, that I went into it thinking I was going to start collecting, so to speak. I think I went into it thinking I'm going to check this stuff out. Is kind of where I really actually think I've sort of started. Was like, oh, I like that. Let me try that. And so, I combined that with sort of the sales thing and early on wasn't sure, like the old Chris Reeve knife was expensive, right? I kind of had a moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure I can spend $400 on a knife. That's a lot of money type of thing. And I went through that whole, like I think a lot of collectors probably do, or future collectors do. You have that moment of that aha moment where it's like, this is really expensive, and I don't know if, I mean, that's a lot of money. It represents a lot of money and a lot of time, whatever. And obviously everybody's budgets are different. People come from different, socioeconomic backgrounds. I get that, but still, even then, you may have the disposable income, but if you're not really if you don't know it, it's a lot of money, right? It's like, gosh, $400, I could be doing a lot of things with that. And so I kind of just started out that way, and then it was buy this, sell that, to buy this, to sell this, to buy that. So I, keep this, don't keep this, keep it for a while, sell it later. I did a lot of that. I still do some of that, that carries forward, but I do it on a much bigger scale at this point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, congratulations on sobriety. It's interesting to me, I guess, in some ways, because, and I hope you don't mind if I kind of make this observation, but when you go from, I guess, some levels of addiction or whatever, you can find supplements to that sometimes by collecting or CrossFit or fitness or something that's like a still fulfills like that thing that your mind is looking for, but it's not the like self-destructive or abusive component of it as much.
That's 100% spot on. They're usually, if you have sort of those tendencies, then I think you look for replacements to some extent. It can be food, it can be lots of things, but it could be collecting, could be nice. So yes, there is some of that. I think. I think for me, there was also this sort of opportunity to. It represented a little bit of this opportunity to like go do something I've always wanted to do but never did. It was like, okay, now I've got this more clear-headed, more free time, more disposable income. Truthfully,
Yeah, absolutely.
Things of that nature, kind of a redirection of my energies. And it's just something I put my energy into. And like I said earlier, I'll say it again, the relationship thing is kind of what makes you stay around, that part. If it was just knives alone, I'm not sure I'd still be here. But with the relationships, I'm here because I'm bought in, and I've kind of, they're my people at this point. It's my crowd that kind of replaced maybe the people at the bar or whatever, that kind of thing. I've just found a lot of people around the knife community that I really enjoy spending time with and commiserating with, and some of them I've met, and some of them I have not met, and some of them we've only met online, that kind of thing. But it's been a good journey, and that's kind of, I think that's where your question was coming from, is like, how do I find myself here and so forth. So, I don't mind sharing, and I don't mind your comment at all. I think that's accurate. I think that a lot of times people do replace certain, if you have a addictive personality or what have you, I think that it's not uncommon that if you're trying to beat the addiction piece, you tend to move that addiction into something else. That's not, and I would say in my case, that's probably inaccurate to some extent. There's some accuracy to that comment. So it's a little bit of my my personal backstory, but I have no problem sharing it. So.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate that vulnerability too, because and it's not like obviously I never want it to come across as I'm trying to like marginalize the transition from addiction to sobriety as like just trading one addiction for another. That's really it has to be stated, but it's mostly that I think that like personally for me as a knife maker, I don't realize sometimes the relationships that I have with customers specifically matter sometimes as much as they do. And to me, like really, that's kind of like you mentioning that, and like the community and everything being something that is like means something to you, especially in that transition from addiction to sobriety. Really makes me think sometimes more about like the duty that I have to make sure that my customers are taken care of. That it's not just sometimes a transactional type of thing, but to check in and to I don't know, maybe think a little bit more about that. Maybe something I do could be the difference in whether somebody continues on the path of sobriety or the path of knowing that they are loved and cared for and things too. Because I feel that way as a maker. Like I really do feel that way. Like I love all my customers. Like without you guys investing in my work and my time, I wouldn't do it because I couldn't afford to do it. But to think about that on multiple layers, to me is kind of a profound statement, and I really appreciate you sharing that with me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like I said, I've been in some form of customer service and sales my whole career, and I go back to the motorcycle business days. We had 7 employees when I started. We started this franchise that was actually rebuilt from salvage motorcycle business, and we took on Triumph, and then we took on Ducati, then we took on Moto Guzzi, then we took on Vespa year after year after year. We did that 4 straight years, those 4 franchises, and so we were in Denver, and we started in 2000 with Triumph, and by 2003 we were the number 1 Triumph dealer in the United States for both 2003 2004. Market share across those brands in the motorcycle world is very small. It's you're talking about approximately 1%, with like Harley being like 50 or so percent at that time anyway, and then the rest being made up pretty much by the Japanese makers and so forth. So we were in a very unique boutique, and one might argue higher end, although Triumph brought in a mid-range kind of price point at that point in time. Ducati was a little more esoteric and a little higher end. And we grew that business though, so we took on these franchises and we grew that business from 7 employees to 35 employees. And when I left that business in 2006, it was about a $5 million a year dealership, and we'd grown it grassroots. And I was, like I mentioned to you earlier, I was the president of the Triumph Club in Denver for 6 years. And the whole initial reason why that was the case was because we wanted to have a riders club represented in the market we were in. And so I took the responsibility to be to sign people up and have a meeting and show up and go for rides and build it. And it just grew and grew and grew and grew. And that just like that business did, and just like other businesses do, I would suspect that somebody who, like yourself, knife maker, I assume I don't know if you have employees. I assume maybe you don't, or maybe you have 1 or so, but it is a business and that you're doing, and I assume it's not a hobby. Let's say it's not a hobby, but it could be. But it goes from that to being a business, to a source of income, to how you support your family and so forth. And I know it sounds cliched, but you have to put your customer first, I think. And there's a big you can grow your business that way if you just treat it transactionally. I don't know. Something to me always gets lost in the the shuffle there. I think that you put your heart and soul into stuff, and that comes through. And when that comes through, you make a personal connection. And when you make the personal connection, that's what keeps people around, and it's what grows things organically for you that you can't do, and you almost can't buy it really. And I think you'd asked me at one point or previous to this call, why collectors, or how a new knife maker would potentially appeal, or where would I maybe buy, or why would I buy a new knife from a new knife maker, and that kind of thing. And like I'd said earlier, I think the relationship part, obviously there's a quality question and what you're producing and all that stuff too. So you need to, all that stuff has to resonate. But let's assume you're producing a good product, and you've got a skill set and so forth, and things are quality. At the end of the day, a big piece of that, making the connection part, is what's going to propel you and actually allow you to grow your business. It's what I feel, that's what gets, a big piece of like me getting into this hobby has been exposure from other people saying, you really need to check this guy out. You should check this out. He's a great guy too. Da da da. That always seems to go in there with that conversation, almost invariably, at least with the people I've gotten to know. It's always a part of that conversation. He's a great guy, takes care of you, stands behind his work. Obviously produces great piece. If it appeals to you, you should check it out. So that word of mouth is really, in most cases, that tends to be what kicks me into like checking out another maker or a new maker, somebody to actually collect. That's really usually where it comes from. It doesn't necessarily come from me scouring the internet, looking at new stuff. It comes from somebody I trust telling me I should be looking at this. And that comes from you making a connection with your customers along the way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I with as much time that goes into making knives, because there's not a situation in handmade knives where you're not investing like really your blood, sweat, and tears and putting out a good product. Like you're kind of selling your baby a little bit, and it's almost like a sacred transaction. And it's like, for me at least, I would prefer that my knives go to somebody who's going to enjoy and use them. There's always this like weird spot in a knife maker's journey where you kind of, maybe you make knives and you'll never really get to know the people who buy them, especially on online transactions. It seems like, somebody buys something off of like an e-commerce site. It is very sterile, transactional, right? But knife shows are like the bee's knees. Like I love knife shows because I really get to connect the dots where my knives are going, talk to the people that come up to my table and everything. And I love that aspect of it way more than I do on just the e-commerce side. But oddly enough, it seems like e-commerce and kind of selling on groups randomly is kind of the way that a lot of knife makers have to make their dues and everything to keep everything running. So it's interesting to me like how one would go about trying to nurture those relationships, especially when a lot of us never get to actually see each other in person.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of them do happen through chat, and they do happen through instant messaging and PMs and all that. And excuse me, I agree with you that I would assume that the opportunity to get out to a show and actually shake hands and press the flesh, as you say, and meet people face to face, and maybe sell your product to somebody and hand it to them and shake their hand and all. I mean, that is, I'm sure there's a lot of satisfaction in that, and it's probably the best case scenario. Now, if you're trying to make a living doing it, it's not realistic for every transaction. And, fortunately, we do have the internet, and fortunately, we do have these groups, and fortunately, you can build a business and online and market yourself online. And there are a lot of examples of knife makers who have done a really great job of doing that. I point maybe to Jared Ozer, as a great example of somebody who is a great guy. I got to know Jared about when he started making knives, maybe just after. But I've known him a long time, and and we chat here and there. And some years we don't chat so much, and some years we've chatted more. And lately, I've been running into him at the shows, and he and I have just a really nice connection. And so he's got that going for him, that he's just a great guy. He's also got a great eye, and he's also done a really fantastic job, frankly, of growing a very good business grassroots through the internet.
Yeah.
And I'm not really talking about his website, Jared. I think it's jaredozer.com. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Facebook group specifically. That's what I'm talking about. He's done a really, really great job of cultivating his brand through that website, and it's a brand. Your name at that level is your brand, right? I mean, that's what it's about. And he's done a really, I think, fantastic job of doing that, and made a fairly successful business out of it. It doesn't hurt that he's a hell of a knife maker too, but at the end of the day, he's built a really nice business that way, and he's sold online and in various, I'll also say this, it doesn't hurt to have a few different lines in the water, an internet site, Facebook group. I don't know, what are the other methods you might try to sell through? I mean, obviously, if you're able to do something production oriented at some point and get it out there to the secondary sellers of the world and that kind of thing, or the primary sellers of the world, if you will, some of the big names. That would be great. That may be a little bit unrealistic at the earlier stages with somebody maybe who's trying to get started, of course. But at the end of the day, I do think, there are various ways to skin the cat, as they say. And, I think not being a one-trick pony, too. So having a few various ways you do that, and other things I think you can do, too, that you see that are, I guess Instagram. I don't do Instagram a lot, but I'm out there. I do it, but I see people bounce between it. I see people do different things like lottos and do different things like, all their different marketing, I guess they would be kind of marketing techniques to be able to make things exciting and get people engaged, that kind of thing. So I think there's that too. And I know that that's hard because you have to wear a lot of different hats. And sometimes you might be really good at making knives, but you might not be very good at marketing, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me, I'm all about like talking about personal challenge and stuff like that on here. I don't really mince too many words when it comes to like my successes, but I really felt like when I entered knife making that I wanted to make a really good knife. Like that was my idea. And I focused a lot on that, and I never posted any pictures or did anything like that. I was actually a member of the Knife Makers Guild and started doing shows before I really did a lot of any online posting or anything, mostly because I think it meant something to me to have validation from other makers that I kind of like I'd done a good job of learning how to make knives. And I think maybe in some ways I hurt myself a little bit because like not being willing to just like show that I was in the learning process and everything. People could have seen for like almost 7 years that I'd been making knives. And then to just like all of a sudden come onto the scene and say like, hey, like, I make these really good, looking knives and everything. You want to buy them and help me out to continue this expensive hobby, failing business. I don't know what you'd call it, right? When in the early days of knife making, right? But I think that maybe I screwed up a little bit there, and I it's all like life is all about like coulda, shoulda, wouldas, and I don't have any regrets, but I do think about somewhat of a what that looks like to the outside world and how I could have done that better if I was maybe a little bit more transparent about like the journey that I was going on in knives.
Yeah, I mean that's I think that's a really interesting comment, actually. That if you think about it, you have somebody here who what you're saying. I'll I'll restate what you just said, which is that you basically went out and learned how to make a knife and try to make the best knife you could and try to really cultivate your skills, let's say, before ever attempting to go out and actually just sell knives, really, and try to make sure that your skills were up to par before you went out to market yourself. And then all of a sudden you show up on the scene, right? And you're like, oh, I'm here. And you hope that everyone beats down your door to buy your product. And you really don't have you don't have a name at that point, right? So therein lies the branding conversation. And so it's already I think it's a very small hobby, really. I mean, I guess it has factions. I get that. There's the tactical world that's got its whole set of people, and fixed blade guys, that have their old world, and slip joint guys, and so forth. But at the end of the day, you're not talking about millions and millions of people here, really. You're talking about, thousands and thousands of people, let's say. But at the end of the day, the ones that are actually participating on the online that I'm reminded of often, which is that I've got collector friends that aren't online. I've got some older guys that I've made connections with through the years that I know in various places they call me, they're like, hey, do you want to buy this? And usually the answer is yes, because I know if I don't buy it, then I might not get the call next time, that kind of thing. Because I've made a lot of these connections through the old school way, the old school ways where you reach out on the phone and you call somebody cold and you introduce yourself and you say, this is, who I am, and so gave me your name and told me to call you, and I just want to introduce myself and let you know that I'm, looking for these things. And at some point in time, if you have any of that and you're interested in, parting ways, let me know. And then you get to know them, And, there's a lot of people that don't do social media or that aren't out there too. So at the end of the day, you do have the opportunity, with, like you say, your journey, so to speak, of kind of documenting your journey, really, of saying, I'm starting here and then I'm here. And so I think, if you show up with a great product, awesome, but you have to get it in front of people. And then you have to actually, and in our world, therein lies kind of the this is where owning it if you're talking about being a collector or user or whatever, because I use some of mine, I don't use some of mine, it's a mixed bag. But from the collection perspective, a big piece of it's owning it, touching it. I've bought lots of knives that I've owned for a day or two, and I'm like, not for me, and I'll move it along, whatever. And then others I keep and so forth. And I have curated, if you will, this collection over the last decade of what appeals to me. And, it's like I said earlier, I've passed some of that stuff on, and I've passed on some plenty good knives for sure. I can't keep them all. I don't intend to. But then I've kept some stuff, and I've grown the collection through time and so forth. And, a big piece of that is having to touch it, feel it, own it. And that's, I think, speaking to what you just said, therein lies your success will come from people touching it, owning it, etc., which is also why shows and so forth, like, you can't do enough shows, really.
Yeah, really.
Truthfully, not at your level. I'm a good friends with Ben Belkin, another guy that I've met who's also great. I mean, just a great guy. I love him to death. He and I have been buying and selling knives for pretty much almost the whole time I've been into knives. In this, second go around in my adult life. And, he and I bought and sold through the years and so forth. And then when he started he, for those who don't know, he's the owner of Jack Wolf Knives. And he's done a really, really great job of growing that brand online in all the different media categories and so forth. And I'm sure he's got lines in the water everywhere, and which is, kudos to him, and it shows what you can do. And we talked pretty extensively before he ever started the company, and when he was designing the knives and working with Enrique. He worked with Enrique Pena, helped him kind of to get the designs right and to connect him with manufacturers and stuff like that. And so we talked at length about that business and the branding side of that and so forth, and what his goals were. to grow the business and so forth. And and I'm super proud of him, and I'm very impressed actually. I mean, he's a very impressive guy. He's done a fantastic job, and honestly, the product is fantastic. I mean, shameless plug, and I know I'm on your show, so hopefully that's okay. But he's done a great job, and I think he would be a good person to look at, or if you don't know him, he would be somebody to speak to maybe and talk to. He would be glad to share with you, I'm sure, some of the things he's done, and so it might be just a thought.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I know his work and everything in the business. I think that, like, he came to the market with a really good production knife, and I have to say, like, I'm really impressed. And I think that that whatever sweet spot he hit, it really has done well for him. But like, I also think that there's lots of things that we don't see at the surface. Like, I mean, you and I are talking about like the finished product is that we see the knives that have come to market, and he's successful in the brand. But I don't honestly know a whole lot about like what the struggle was to get there. Did Enrique give him the ability in some ways, or tips, or a nod or something to make like that happen in some ways? I often find that with knives, it's not just a single person that makes it in this really crazy, like, micro niche world of knives, but typically it's because of the network and the people that and everybody helping each other out. So I'm interested to know those kind of things. I'd love to be able to have him on the podcast and talk through that, because like, I mean, I have my perspective, and I love to talk to you guys to understand a little bit more and give everybody listening food for thought. Because I think that at the end of the day, man, you could tell me 9 million times that I suck at marketing myself and branding, and maybe in the 9 million and first time that you tell me, it would actually click. I mean, so I've been told I've been hard-headed before, but I think that it's important to have that iterated as many times as possible. And I'm going to use it for instance. So my wife and I love watching documentaries and movies and things like that, specifically documentaries. And the History Channel has this it's on its third season, but it's like the foods that built America. And they go through like Milton Kellogg and Pepsi and Coke and everything, and how they built their empires. And the single thing that I've noticed on every single episode, and how they talk about the success factor of those brands, is tenacity, innovation, and understanding that a singular mindset about what it is, like what their value proposition is, are the things that carried them through. So as long as you know, like, what do you actually believe in, and how hard are you willing to work for it, and you stick with that regardless of whether you're in prohibition times, or whether there's some competitor that's trying to cut you out of the market or whatever, that if you believe in that and you singularly focus on that thing, that's what builds brand recognition. And I think that it's valuable. I mean, we're talking about multi-billion-dollar companies today, but back in the day, especially the corollaries to early traditional American cutlery, and like Camelus and other companies like that, is very similar. They were going through the same thing in the mid to late 1800s, and whether it's food or knives or whatever, I really think that it's about a belief system, and being able to understand what your value proposition is in the industry first, and then other people will pick that up eventually.
Yeah, no, I think that's very right on. I think through many years in being in business, you oftentimes will be reminded that you should try to stick to really what you know and what you do well, i.e. what you're kind of saying with value proposition, or what is my mission, if you will. You know, trying to be clear, very clear on that, and as you say, dedicated to a fault. Completely focused, hyper focused on that. And typically, if you're combine that with a need, let's say, then you will find that you will create a market and create a brand. And so I think that's a good analogy. And And at the same time, it's like anything in life. You need some luck and you need timing and you need other things too, right? Divine intervention, if you believe in that kind of thing, sometimes doesn't hurt either.
Yeah.
Um, you know, um, so there is a lot that goes into all of it. But I do think that if you focus on something and you have a good product and you have a product that people would want or need, because people do need knives too. At the end of the day, I think that you can get focused on creating a brand, and there are various ways to do that beyond just hiring a marketing company or paying for trying to go pay for advertising with money you don't have and that kind of thing. And that's something that's pretty cool actually with the internet with so forth. Because back in the day, if you didn't have that kind of platform, it would be a much different conversation, wouldn't it? You wouldn't exactly be in a position to have the exposure that we do and can enjoy in this kind of medium. And so I think being able to take advantage of those things is you're in a position where you could do that. And I think given time, speaking back to your conversation about 7 years later, here I am. I mean, what you really were saying kind of is, yeah, there's a transparency part there, but I think of it less of that part and more of just I'm just starting to get my brand out there now kind of thing. It's just you can't ever start too soon, maybe, is kind of what I heard you say a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really kind of the point. It's like if anybody's going to learn from some of my mistakes, there's always going to be a customer base or a fan base that will accept you like for who you are and what you do. And not everything has to be perfect. But if you don't start at some point, then you enter as like a new maker. Like, so 7 years in, I'm not a new maker, but 7 years in, I am a new maker. And that can be really frustrating because after 7 years of beating the ground and my head against the wall trying to make a good knife, I really do find at some point in times that the sales do not equal the quality of work that I put out. And that can be frustrating because, it's a high stake margin here. I mean, it's there's a lot of money that's been wrapped up in the business to make a good quality blade, and if you don't sell knives, then it's really difficult to make the next one.
Right. No, I bet. I can appreciate that completely. And, I think that I've recognized that through the years with some of the folks that I've collected, and it's interesting because I don't remember, you had said something a while back on one of the chats we had or something along that lines, but I've kind of got I always describe my collection as narrow and deep. And, I've got a set of makers that I kind of focus on. And within those makers, I'm focused on, I need this pattern, or I want one of these, or when the day comes that lockback whittler pops up, I'm going to buy it if I can. That the hunt part. So, but really, I don't actually have like a very wide array of makers and stuff. I've got a pretty narrow. My collection is fairly narrow and deep. And then I'll go off and check this out, and I'll go off and check that out, and I'll buy one of these here or there, or whatever. But pick something up along the way, kind of. But as far as like checking out brand new makers often and things of that nature, usually I won't unless I run into I have somebody bring it here to my house, or I go to a show, or I got a friend that I go meet or something like that, and they're like, oh, check this out, and then I get to touch, feel, and that kind of thing. Oh, that is pretty good, that kind of thing. And so there is that breaking into the market part. Even though you're really good, I mean, you pretty much are forced, of course, to, in most cases, sell your wares at a price point that won't turn people off, that'll allow them the opportunity to check it out, get it in hand, and then grow from there. But you can't come in probably charging what you're worth or what you feel you're worth, perhaps. And that's varied, right? Because it's worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. But as a collector, I often run into this, you will see every once in a while a new maker or something on the scene, and all of a sudden you're looking at the price points and you're like, at least from my perspective, you're like, wow, that sure seems like an awful lot for somebody who's like brand new, that kind of thing, which is kind of my version of like, well, I won't be buying that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that's kind of what goes through my head. Maybe I'd change my mind later if I got to handle it and that kind of thing, yes. But being new, I use air quotes, there's also this element of, as a collector, you want the maker you want them bought in long term, right? And so there's that history, as you were kind of getting at, I guess, in saying, if I was able to document my growth over time of my going from learning to where you're at now. The nice thing about that is that people saw where you were at and now where you were coming from and where you are now, and that you've been through things and you're in it for the long haul, and you have the opportunity to, let's say, have conviction around that. It gives confidence is, I guess, the word I'm looking for from a collection perspective, because a lot of times, let's face it, I mean, I've got some great knives from folks that don't make knives anymore, but my whole concept of collecting them kind of goes downhill real quick when they decide they're out of the game, that kind of thing. They may have a great knife, but I'm not nearly as interested in having a big stash of these knives unless I could own them for, pennies on the dollar, which eventually that's kind of what happens, right? So you don't want to be buying those at top dollar and then find out that the maker is gone either. As much as I love knives, my collection is a combination of an investment, a hobby, I appreciate handmade goods. I appreciate the work part, so that's not lost on me at all. The quality. So and therein lies what you may have to offer. I would say would be, having 7 years in, somebody who knows what they're looking at, if they have the opportunity to handle your knives, is going to be able to tell. And sometimes that's the best part too, as far as being a collector, is being able to find somebody where you can get something like that at a good price, and kind of grow with them as their stock rises. You're in early as their stock goes up, that kind of thing too. So,
thank you for listening to this part of the Good Old Blades podcast with my guest Trip Miller. Stay tuned next week for episode 2. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.